I'm Professor Marc-André Léger from the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University, and this is the lecture for Lesson 5 on access controls for the Business Technology Management course, Business Information Systems, Risk, Security, and Audit, also known as BTM 440. So this lecture concerns access control, so understanding that access control is the process of controlling who has access to what resources. The goal being to prevent unauthorized usage and to better protect the different IT resources that we have in our organizations from potential threats. Access control may also serve, other than authorizing access to systems, ensuring the identity of individuals who are connecting to systems, and may also serve for auditing purposes, accounting purposes, and other organizational purposes related to control of the systems. So there's really 4 components to that. So the identification, who is accessing the system; the authentication, so can their identities be verified; authorization, so what exactly can the requester access and what can they do; and accountability, how are actions traced to an individual to ensure that the person who makes data or system changes can be identified. So this is often identified by the acronym IAAA, or sometimes just AAA. So authentication, authorization, and accountability. From a policy point of view and a policy enforcement point of view, so we need in place policies that are going to that we're going to allow that are going to enable us to enforce them within the organizational context, and that are going to define who can do what and why and how. So that's really going to put down on paper inside of an access control policy, part of your global strategy of information security policies that we talked about in the previous lecture. And then at the policy enforcement phase, then we're going to apply this policy by granting or rejecting access or requests for accesses based on the authorizations that were defined in the policy. So that is more sort of I guess you could say more of a technical component of it, where people in IT or in different IT groups of the organization are going to be actually giving the accesses or in controlling the accesses on the basis of this policy that had been created, which is more something that's happening at a management or more strategic level based on the goals, the policies of what it is that we're trying to do as an organization, what are the organizational needs that we have. And this is, as we've mentioned before, going to have to be in line with the governance strategy of the organization. So we have 2 types of access controls. Physical access. So here we're talking about the access to buildings, so physical locations. And then the logical access. So this is basically the computer systems, to network, to things that require typically, when you're thinking about user ID and password, we're talking about logical access controls here. So all kinds of mechanisms can be used for physical access control. Smart cards are probably the most common, which are programmed with a ID number. So these are used in all kinds for all kinds of means to get physical access to office doors, elevators, parking lots, as well. Some shared office buildings may have some additional cards that are used for after-hours access. And so these cards are typically given to give access to physical resources. A little bit like a key, I guess. But it's like a key that can be programmed so that you can disable the access remotely without having to physically take away somebody's key. The logical access controls are a mechanism for deciding who can access to what, who can access to the different systems. We'll also be monitoring who accesses the system and what they're doing on the system. And this will be useful for either restraining or influencing a user's behavior on that system. I forget if we talked about the panopticon effect before, but remind me to talk to you guys about that, and the influence that control mechanisms will have on users. And they don't actually have to. We don't actually have to be watching the users, but if they know that there's a possibility that they're going to be watched, this is going to have an influence on their behavior. So we need to not only do it, but we need also to make sure that the users or the stakeholders are aware that this is a definite possibility. On the computer itself, there's something called the security kernel. So this is the mechanisms for the part of the operating system that is going to enforce the access control for systems. So it's sort of a central point of access control. And it's going to allow us to have sort of a central reference monitor. So like a security guard, basically a gatekeeper, that is going to be managing all of these different these different elements of access control, and based on ACL, so the access control list is going to be at the center of that. So that means that we're going to be putting in place policies, access control policies, which are basically have 4 components. So the users, so these are the people who use the system, right? The resources, so these are the objects in the system that are being protected. The actions, so the activities that the authorized users can do on the resources. And then the relationships, so which are additional conditions that exist between the users and the resources. So these are what are going to be defined in, well, I guess depends on the system, but basically we're going to create some policy objects in the Windows world. This would be known as a GPO. And these security policy objects are going to be defining the users, what the users have access to. They're going to be defining all of the resources. Think of the networks, the computers, the printers, the peripherals, the devices, everything on that network is an object, and this object is going to be subject to a certain number of policies. These policies are going to define, who can do what, where. And then there might be some additional elements, particular conditions or exceptions that may be implemented. So this is something that I believe that in one of the labs you'll be looking at how this is done. One of the labs that we're doing in this course. So we have different types of access control systems, different access control solutions. Perhaps the more fun one is the biometrics, right? So we're using either static or dynamic features, things like fingerprints, iris scan, retina scan, whatever, or dynamic voice inflections, keyboard strokes, signature motions. We have tokens, so either synchronous or asynchronous tokens. So things like a smart card, for example, a memory card, a secure ID RSA token, which is what I use on a regular basis, and other systems or solutions of that nature. But it's something that you have, the token. The biometrics is something that you are as a person, so that's a different type. And then the third factor, the third type of authentication, which is really the most common historically, is passwords, which is something that you know. So, but here, of course, passwords, to be useful, they have to be well used. They have to be strong passwords, sufficiently long passwords. And again, here's something that we'll talk about in our discussions and in the labs about different types of password and the efficiency or lack thereof for passwords. So passwords are limited. We have a lot of experience on breaking passwords. Just look at in the movies, you see a lot of examples of how people have been breaking passwords, all the way since early computers and the different programs that were used, development programs in World War II, like in the movie, what's it called? I forget, but you know the movie I'm talking about with Alan Turing trying to hack the German Enigma machines. And so there's a lot of work has been going on to that. Another type of logical control is the SSO, the single sign-on. So this is using either Kerberos or some kind of secure login environment. where we have a stringent multi-factor authentication, perhaps, to allow people to log in a very secure manner, and then we use that login to connect to multiple resources within our environment, rather than asking people to remember a whole bunch of different access protocols and passwords, which in the end really ends up making the whole thing less secure, because when people have too many passwords to remember, they're just going to use easy passwords. So a single sign-on strategy might be to use KeePass or some form of password vault. And in using that, you're going to actually become more secure, because even though you only have one password, you make it very, very difficult. You make it very, very secure, this one password. And then you use that as a key to unlock all the other resources. And internally, they're going to be able to use very complex passwords as well. So the different policies, so for authorization, are going to be based very often on user-assigned privileges. We're also going to have group policies, and then we're going to have organizational level policies. So if we put that in the context of a Microsoft Active Directory solution, which is authorization mechanisms, you will have organizational units, you will have groups, you will have and you will have the user rights. So these are just going to be different levels of authentication that are going to be used. So different methods, usernames, smart cards, biometrics, different guidelines, actions, accounting. So let's start with authentication types. So knowledge, something that you know. Ownership, something that you have. Characteristics, something that is unique to you. Location, somewhere that you are. And action, something that you know how to do, or something that you do. So these are different types of authentication types that we may use. So for example, by knowledge, so password. Of course, I talked about weak passwords that are very easy to crack by all kinds of either just brute force, or trying every single possibility, or a dictionary, using words in the dictionary, because we know how to. We know that most people will use a word, an actual word, for their password. So if we try every word in the dictionary of the language spoken by the person, then there's a good chance we might actually just get the password fairly easily. And there's a whole bunch of best practices that we need to know about, but long passwords should be at least, well, I guess it depends who you ask, but somewhere between 8 to 12 characters, uppercase, lowercase, special characters. They need to be changed often. If we figure that it'll take maybe 50 days to do a brute force attack on a password of 6 characters, then we should change the password every 45 days, and so on. And so there's a whole bunch of best practices again that you can look up. These tend to change every once in a while, but basically long password, not a word in the dictionary, change it regularly, special characters, uppercase, lowercase, not specifically replacing some letters like all the E's replacing by a 3 or something like that. It's just too easy. Passphrases are a good way, which is a lot stronger than the password. So a small phrase that you remember, something that you're going to remember, but that somebody couldn't guess about you. We definitely want to have account lockout policies. So if somebody tries maybe 3 times, it'll lock the account for a certain amount of time and require perhaps to go to the security department. So I have a system for my website, because there's a lot of people who seem to be for some reason to hack my website, which I think is crazy, because there's really nothing there, but perhaps to hurt my reputation, I guess. And if somebody tries to log in, and people try to log in every day on my server, if people try to log in after 2 tries, it'll automatically lock them out for 1 month. And so if they want to try every single password possibility, it'll take them years. Right, because they just it would just keeps lock them. So it locks the IP address, it locks the user, it locks the account. It just locks a whole bunch of stuff. And so these are the kind of policies that you need to think about and put in place. And then obviously also you need to create audit logs. So you need to keep logs of people who attempt logins or people who successfully log in, including their IP address and all the information, the time, so that if something does happen, you can come in later and try to identify that. So authentication by ownership, this is like the token I was talking about before, like an RFID token that are fairly common. Of course, now it's just easier just to do it with your smartphone. So you send it's a token that is not something that is always the same. So it's either time-based or events-based. So there's something that causes a unique code to be given to you through this token, and then or given to you, or perhaps directly sent to the device itself. If you have like a token reader, then it could be read on the machine, or perhaps with a smartphone, a QR code, a unique QR code, and that you put in front of the webcam. It shows that in order to have that code means you have to have the actual device. And so that would provide this authentication by ownership. So of course, I mean, nothing is perfect. The token itself or the phone could be stolen. So basically, the way that this works, the user sends a request to the authentication server. Then the authentication server receives a challenge. And the user enters the challenge number with like a pin on the smartphone. The smartphone calculates the response, like the password. The user sends the password to the server. Then the authentication grants the access to the application. So there's, in this case, a 6-step process. It might seem a little harsh, but in reality, this happens very, very quickly. And I'm guessing most of you have probably experienced this many times before. In the authentication by characteristics, or commonly known as biometrics, either we're going to look at something that's specific to you, who you are, or something about your behavior, like how you say your name, your voice intonation, how you say a specific phrase or something like that. Again, here's something that I'm sure you've seen many times in movies, or perhaps have also experienced. That's more common now. Of course, there's some concerns about that. There's some discussion about how accurate that is. You can think of fingerprints could be affected by having dirty hands. So in some areas, this might be some kind of jobs, this might be a little bit of a problem. The reaction time. And then the acceptability, the social acceptability. Imagine, for example, if I want to do facial recognition in a place where people are wearing face masks. That would be a problem. That wouldn't work. And would it be acceptable to ask people to remove their face masks in a time of a pandemic, for example? So there's all kinds of issues relating to that. So there's a whole bunch. Fingerprints are probably the earliest kind that have been used. Again, fingerprints can change over time. It's a possibility. If you cut your hand, cut your finger, or whatever. Of course, like you see in the movie, I could bypass that by just cutting off your hand and using it to log in. But I guess that's, it doesn't happen every day. Let's put it this way. Certainly not in Canada, anyway. Palm prints, the geometry of your hand or of your face, your retina, your iris, how you type, your voice, etc. Authentication by location and action. So if you are in a particular place, there's a good chance that this indicates that you are who you're supposed to be. And so it may be a good way, additional way to add a layer to that. So it means you must have physical access to a particular place. And then, so based on that and additional information, so maybe a access card plus physically being in the building plus a retina scan. I mean, it depends on, the risk. So at the base of this whole thing of determining how much do I need is obviously going to be a risk assessment. And so the different actions are going to require storing different patterns or nuances of how you do something and recording these patterns. So the single sign-on to a computer or network all at once, and the authentication and authorization credentials allow a user to access all the computers and all the systems that were authorized reduces human error, but it's well, they say here difficult to put in place, and that was certainly true a few years ago. Today, there's a lot of different tools and mechanisms in place in order to do that. Ldap, Kerberos are probably the more common ones that are used here. So sort of a centralized directory access mechanism, like Ldap. And for us, probably the most popular one, the most common one being used today is by Microsoft with Active Directory. And it has modules and mechanisms in place in Active Directory in order to make this possible. So it'll have gateways and bridges to connect to other systems, as well as some systems that aren't really directly connected to Microsoft. So think of what we're doing here at the university. We have your net name and your password. And it's used for accessing everything, like your Moodle, like your Zoom, like the library systems, like your My Concordia environment, to signing up for courses and getting your grades and everything. That's a SSO. That's a single sign-on. So from the point of view of accountability and procedures, so obviously log files, and we're going to need to review these log files. We're going to need to keep this data for long enough that we understand how that we're sure that we're not going to need it anymore. So in most cases, since it might be a year or two down the road when we realize that something happened, we want to keep this data for a long time. We want to also make sure that we know how we're going to be disposing of this media when we don't need it anymore. And we're going to probably have legal requirements for compliance to certain of the accountability, so the login information. And if we refer back to the lecture about compliance, what we were talking about then, this will have a lot of implications relating to all the logs and things that we need to keep track on and keep for the future. So there's some actual models, like a rule-based access control, RBAC, but the discretionary access control, mandatory access control, non-discretionary access control. These different mechanisms work in different ways, but they're like formal models that have been devised for the purpose of access controls. So with the discretionary access control, this is operating system-based DAC policies. So with processes in place for new user registration, periodic review, setting permissions, and giving access to the different software, the different applications that we have in a discretionary manner. So I guess this is probably a very common way that this is done. Mandatory access control. So this is based on how the sensitivity or the classification level, if you prefer, of the different resources that we're trying to get access to. And this will have perhaps temporal isolation or time of day restrictions. So this may be used for more sensitive information. And non-discretionary, so access rules that are managed by security administrators. Sensitive files are write protected for integrity, readable only by authorized users. Again, this is a lot more secure. And then the rule-based, so we have a set of business rules, and based on these business rules, then it's going to look at the access request and evaluate if this access request is legitimate at any given time based on the current rules that are in place. So this is works based on these business rules. So depending on how well structured these are, and of course there's going to be different mechanisms and tools and logs that you're going to need to be able to put in place in order to do this kind of thing. So we're going to create the ACLs, the access control lists. And so the access control lists are going to be different based on the different types of operating systems and the systems that we have in place. So there'll be, we'll set permissions like read, write, and execute in a Linux or OS X environment. So Linux servers or Mac OS devices, which are basically running Unix underneath, which most of you don't actually see if you don't go into the terminal windows. And so there's a whole mechanisms based on binary file settings. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with, or I can always explain it, but it's basically using the flags that are being set on the different files and directories and objects on the network. And we can access rights to individual users, the owners of the files, to groups of users, or to all the users in the whole that may access the system. This is all done in sort of a binary manner by setting bits on the file permissions. In a Windows environment, this is done through the graphical user interface in Windows, in which you can have different permissions like sharing permissions, read, write, deny permissions, and you can give access to users based on different parameters. So you might have seen this by if you right-click in your Windows and go into the properties, you're going to see how you can set all the security settings on either files, directories, or again objects. As well, in the Windows environment, you can do this on a server level. So that's another thing as well. And with the security objects, GPOs, with setting global security policies. But that somewhat work in the same way, but they're just generally applied to groups or to organizational units within the organization, or that are using a different physical machine, different servers in the context of Active Directory. So this is an example of an access control list, so just like a simple table basically. In reality, when you're actually doing it in the system, it doesn't exactly look like this. But this gives you an idea of overall what this would sort of look like. So in an RBAC environment, so role-based access control, we would have implicit rules that are given to different users. And through the customer service agent role, so these users have this role, and because they have this role, then they have certain functions. So this is a good way to do it because it's connecting individuals to roles, and then it's giving access to the people based on their roles. So if somebody's role changes, we don't have to go and change the access controls of that individual. We just change it based on the group. So we basically assign them to a new group. We change what their role is, and then they will have the new access rights that are related to this new role. If we assign rights to individuals, this means that every time an individual changes his role, or perhaps a new employee arrives or somebody leaves, it's going to be extremely difficult because we might end up that we have to keep user accounts working even if a person isn't there anymore, because there's a software or an application or something that we do that's just not going to work anymore. In my personal experience, this has often been a payroll application. And this is a bit of a problem if your payroll stops working, as I've seen it done a few times, because a user had left and the application had to be run under that user ID. It had been set up that way. So, so by doing it by roles and assigning roles to assigning individuals to groups and to roles, then we just can move somebody in and out of a role, but it doesn't affect the access rights and the access controls that are in place. So basically assigning the roles based on, as I mentioned, on groups and giving the accesses to groups. We can constrain the user interfaces, so that's one way that we can control some access as well. So by limiting what they can do, limiting what they can do at the user interface level. Think of Windows with the policies that I was talking about. So for example, configuring their profile so that there's certain functionalities that they don't have access to. And also using things like encryption, so that an authorized user, then it will be decrypted, and he or she will be able to access certain resources, but otherwise they're going to be locked. In cases where, think of a laptop being stolen, this may be a way to help with that. Some other models that are popular, Bell Lapalooza model, the Biba, the Clark and Wilson, the Brewer and Nash. We're not going to go over all of these, just so you know that they exist and that they, like some of them, like for example, the Brewer and Nash is based on integrity issues that are defined, so business rules basically. And when it identifies potential integrity issues, as in this case, like a conflict of interest, then it will block access to certain resources. So we're very concerned with breaches. We're very concerned with breaches and access control. And because, well, for many reasons, but these are some of the few here. Probably, in my experience, the big one would be the disclosure of private information, either for profit or otherwise. Potential a big issue that I'm sure you'll want to discuss in the Q&A session that's not being recorded. But you know, all organizations suffer from this, and there's many examples that I think we've talked about some of them before in the course already. And so that's probably the biggest effect of these breaches. Corruption of data, loss of business property, business intelligence, corporate secrets, intellectual property, dangers to either our facilities, our staff, our systems, our equipment, and then of course failures of our systems and our business processes. And these are some of the big effects. So when we talk about impacts, remember when we're doing a risk assessment, we're going to be looking at the impact of a vulnerability. Here the vulnerability is based on the access. The threat is the potential either mischievous employee, disgruntled employee, or cyber criminal who violates our access control. And so the effect of that is the potential damages that are going to be creating. So in the cases where we have those three elements, as you know, then we have potential risk. So some of the threats that we have, threats of getting physical access to machines, eavesdropping by observation, using some of the tools like protocol scanners and analysis tools that we've used in the labs, just bypassing the security, exploiting the hardware or software, reusing or discarding media, electronic eavesdropping, intercepting communications, accessing our networks, or exploiting vulnerabilities in some of our applications. So of course this will have a negative effect on the organization, like loss of customer confidence, loss of opportunities, financial penalties, new regulations being imposed on us. This is a short list. The list could be a lot longer than that. So credentials and permissions management. And these are the systems that are going to be providing the ability to collect, to manage, and to use the information associated with access control. And in Microsoft, it's the GPOs that I talked about before, the group policies and the group policy objects. That's what we're going to be using in order to do that in a Microsoft environment, which is the most local area networks and network environments in organizations today are using this Microsoft Active Directory solution. We can have centralized access or decentralized access controls in a centralized authentication, authorization, and accounting server. So like a Radius server, which is probably the most popular, which is something that you can install in a Unix or Linux environment. TACAX Plus, which is an IETF standard. Diameter, SAML. For now, I guess these are just like buzzwords for you. They probably don't really mean much. But I think once you've experimented with those and with some of these in real life, then they'll make more sense. But think of them as they're just different solutions that can be used. Some of them open source. Some of them are implemented in different types of commercial products, and they have their own set of parameters of how you can use them. If you know how to use a Radius server, then you can use different products that are going to be using that. Radius might be something that you could use for example, to control access to wireless local area networks. Decentralized access control. So this is in the hands of the people closest to the system users. So like password authentication, challenge, handshake authentication, mobile device authentication, So again, here there's just different strategies, different standards or mechanisms that are put in place in order to do that. Acceptable use policies and different tools that are going to be used for monitoring privacy issues, monitoring in the workplace. So like, yeah, who's opening emails, who's reading emails, who's how people logging, putting in place mechanisms for logging or recording the different phone calls, the websites. So all of these different mechanisms that we're going to put in place inside of the organization. But these definitely have potential privacy issues. And we can, again, another thing that we might want to discuss in the Q&A session, but to what extent is the organization entitled to use these mechanisms and to a certain degree potentially violate the privacy of its employees and the people using its resources? In reality, it's a little bit, you don't really have an expectation of privacy when you're working for a company that's paying you for your time. So, I mean, they can do it, but within reason, of course, But that's something that's probably best reserved for our discussion. And then cloud computing issues, and I'm not sure why cloud computing is here. But there's all kinds of mechanisms in place for cloud computing relating to security. I don't know. I'm just not. I guess I'm not going to cover cloud computing here. We'll do this as a separate topic because not really sure how this connects to what we've been discussing about access control. So anyway, so that was the lecture. This is part of several lectures that are happening in that single week. So that's why I tried to make it not too long. So we covered the main aspects of this chapter of the book.